me to start?
Sure.
All right, so I think John's going to join us whenever he arrives, but apparently he's coming from the OR. But yeah, so Tony kind of came up with this prompt of whether or not it's relevant for residents to, if it's worth it for them to do research and what they can get out of it, and especially if they're not planning on going into academic career or physician scientist career. So I thought maybe we can introduce who we are, what we do in our labs, and then a number of you submitted questions, so we can probably start addressing those questions. Keep it pretty informal, but people want to interject. So maybe I'll start. So I'm probably the newest person here. I'm Nate Redeker Flynn. I'm an assistant professor in the head and neck division. Just a PhD, so.
Not just a PhD.
Just a PhD.
I'm a PhD.
I'm a PhD.
No just a.
Yeah. But I am married to a physician, so I know a little bit about clinical work, if that counts. And I did my PhD at, actually in the same program that Tina did her MD PhD in, which is like the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology program. So we do a little bit of work in the clinics and rotations in the clinics, but we never actually go any further than that unless some people go on to do MDs afterwards. But our lab is a tumor immunology lab. We're pretty focused on understanding the processes of metastasis. We do a lot of mouse models, but part of my inclination for joining this department was to move more into the clinical, clinical sample side of things and do more human work. And, so that's our boat. I've never had a resident in my lab. We tend to be like pretty mechanistic, so our projects have taken a little bit longer. But I'm just getting started, so see how things go.
All right. I'm Stefan Haut. I'm a purebred scientist, PhD, developmental geneticist by training, and I got my PhD in Germany. Did a postdoc at the Rockefeller Institute with Jim Hudspeth, 95 to 2000. Then I had started my lab at the EPL in Boston at the Mount Sinai. Was there 5 years, was a faculty member, got to know Tina as a student there, didn't meet you. 2005 I got recruited to Stanford, and back then we worked a lot on making hair cells from stem cells. That's basically how my lab made a name for itself. Recent years we have switched a lot to figuring out the fundamentals, why non-mammalian vertebrates are regenerating and how do they regenerate hair cells. So work a lot with chickens and quails and with mice, and that's what we do. I have no clinical kind of exposure in a way. I had a couple of residents in the lab, but that is more than 10 years ago. Since then I'm successfully scaring them away. And I have a little bit of venture experience in the last 5 years where I did some work in the venture field. I was on the board of directors of a couple of cancer immunotherapy companies and gained some experience there.
How are they doing?
One of them is doing really well.
Okay.
And that's it, yeah. And yeah, currently I have rotation students and graduate students in the lab and postdocs. But I'm not against having residents in my lab.
All right. Hi. I am Beth Dorenzo. I've been here at Stanford for 9 years now, which is hard to believe. But I started my training at Purdue University, where I did my undergraduate degree, my clinical master's in speech language pathology, and then I followed my clinical master's degree with my PhD. Studying voice physiology in both human participants, but as well as in kind of a porcine excise tissue model, and then went forth to the University of Wisconsin to do 3 years of postdoctoral work, kind of expanding into more kind of mouse and cell culture models of laryngeal mucosal biology before joining the faculty here. So since I've been here, I have been 50% clinical and 50% research, and that split really hasn't changed. The main focus on my lab, as most people know, is on basic translational laryngeal mucosal biology. We're very interested in the interaction of the environment and essentially what we're inhaling and the health of the tissues of the larynx. So whether that be e-cigarettes, cigarettes, wildfire smoke, various types of particulate matter, that's the type of work that we do in understanding the mechanisms of injury and then disease development to the larynx. So I come at this from a slightly different angle than as I do have my PhD. It was a pure PhD program, but I also have a clinical degree, and I also still do practice clinically here. I have worked with residents since I've been here on various different levels, and I think that including have currently co-mentoring one of our R25 clinician scientist residents, Joanne, who's in her second year now, and Patrick Kiesling will also be joining my lab starting this summer. So I've had the experience of working with residents for extended periods of time in the lab, but also I've had a number of residents kind of rotate through on more of a kind of temporary based project, and some of those projects are very clinical based, working with our student singers, a cappella, so definitely me bringing kind of my clinical side of things in, but also, believe it or not, we've also done some more basic science with some of the residents on their research rotations, so I think we've learned a lot from that, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, but we've done it, so I think I can bring that perspective to the table some today too.
That's great. Should we start with some of these questions?
Let's start with some of the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, question? No.
Yeah, feel free to interject.
I think we had a couple of really good questions.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any of these questions, so I am so excited.
So we'll start with you answering them, Beth. Yeah, so one of the questions is, should residents do basic science research if they've never done it, or should they stick to clinical research, and do doctors need to understand the difficulties of basic science research?
I think that, was the word should do basic science research,
That was
or could?
I think it was should, but you could probably answer.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that, like, I don't know, I think that the wording can make a difference. I mean, I think if the answer is, should all residents be required to do basic science research? I think the answer is no to that. I think that the type of research that we can do in an otolaryngology department can span basic, translational, clinical, right? So if the answer is, should they do research? I think that's another answer, but should they do basic science research? No. Or no, I don't think that's a have to. Not necessary. The question is, if they, let's say you have a really eager resident who doesn't have basic science experience, who has, let's say, a 12 weeks at a dedicated time, can they take on a basic science project? And from my experience, the answer is it can be yes, but it requires an excessive amount of support, and it's not going to be their project alone. It's going to be their project paired with someone else in the laboratory, right? And I think that there's a lot of discussions that have to go into that beforehand, but do I think it's possible? Yeah. If again, you have someone who really wants to come and do it, in my opinion.
I think the residents that will do well in doing basic science projects are the ones that already have some training and that went in labs, were in labs when they were medical students. So if you're a medical student and you want to come to a lab, do this early and get experience, and if you like it, then you find a way during residency to seek out that basic science lab that is of interest. Doesn't even have to be in the department, can be somewhere else, right? And you can do a project there and get involved there. Yeah, and I agree, we shouldn't force people to do basic science, particularly if they have no training. They will break things. And then in my lab, we use a lot of viruses nowadays, and it's probably not good for them. So, so I think we should give them all opportunities, and they should select. Raise the question: should we be selective for students who have a tendency for basic science, and that's a later question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the gamut of basic science research is pretty broad. So there's projects you could envision where you can have a whole paper that's based off of one technique, and the technique doesn't require, like, it's not patch clamping or something that would require a lot of practice. It might be maybe just doing histology on a lot of stuff that would, you can still learn a lot from, or maybe it's this, library prep, and you really hone that skill, and maybe within the course of a fairly reasonable amount of time, you could produce a good amount of data with one technique. Our lab is maybe the other, in some ways, a lot of the other things where, everyone in my lab is, even the, we're a grad student heavy lab, but even all the grad students came in with years of experience, and even still, I'm down there for a lot of the more advanced mouse stuff, helping them with their experiments. So, like, those things are not really probably as amenable to research. But I think basic science could span the gamut. I don't know, JP, maybe you have thoughts too. I know what your lab is like.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to kind of chime in here and there. I mean, I think it's very hard to incorporate people who don't have prior scientific experience quickly and efficiently. I think that's just really a challenge. I mean, clearly you shouldn't be forced to do scientific work if it's not your passion. I think it's worthwhile to note that our field has a history of forcing people to do scientific work. Like, that was a common thing, not that long ago, where there were, like, straws drawn and, different ways of, identifying people. I think we're, as a field, like, past that. And you see the waste or the risk that can ensue from someone being in a lab when that's not where they want to be. So it's pretty easy to say no to that.
Any comments from the audience? I don't know, is it the audience or from others?
Or anyone on Zoom too.
I can read the next question. Next question was, it's basically a statement first. Research is often the main way in which residents can distinguish themselves from others to be competitive for a fellowship. However, the goal of getting as many papers out as possible is not always compatible with learning how to do great research. How can we balance the need to give residents a good feel for the scientific and clinical investigation process with the need for them to get papers? So it's basically paper quantity and the push for getting papers, or really embracing research and just hang out in the lab and do stuff without the pressure to publish papers, right?
Yeah.
Did I get that right, Julian?
Yeah.
I think that's a really great question. And I think that it's a real, I think that's not even just with residents too. I think it happens in grad school too, right? To get competitive postdocs, and then as postdocs to get competitive faculty jobs too, about this whole kind of numbers, right? Like this whole numbers game, right? And one might argue, well, maybe it's about quality over quantity, but we all know in real life that's not necessarily, unfortunately, always the case, right? So how does one rectify that? I think that one of my postdoctoral mentor and I once many times had a conversation about the concept of the least publishable unit. Is anyone familiar with that concept? The idea of kind of the smallest thing that you can, reasonably publish that would be an acceptable story to get into a journal. And we actually have a lot of conversations for and against the least publishable unit. But I do think that there's something to be said for, and this is something that I try to have trainees in my lab do, is, again, this is a little bit harder for us, but have maybe a bigger, longer term project that is more involved. And maybe that it could be clinical, it could be basic, it could be translational. But I think it's also okay to supplement with some other smaller pieces too, like that maybe case series or a small perspective cohort or a chart or a dive into the chart, like a chart review, more base study. I think it's reasonable, but I don't think that we should sacrifice trying to learn about the scientific process just to, again, get numbers. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of when you two have read more of these applications, but when there's someone coming for a UML position to OH&S, are they counting pubs when, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sad truth is that papers are the ticket, and papers is the only acceptable currency that you can put on the table to actually show that you have been able to drive a project to the point where you publish it. So, so I think nothing substitutes for papers. I think there's a big difference between just cranking out papers and building a credible trajectory. And I think that is important in basic science. And I think it's also important in the clinical or clinician scientist world, where you should be following where your interests are, but your interests should go along a path, and the papers that you publish should actually be solid, and don't fall into that trap in doing shortcuts and publish bullshit, because ultimately this paper will always be online, it will always be around, your name will always be on it, and it could actually bite you in the back at some point. So a bad paper can actually also influence a promotion decision as well as a good paper.
I mean, I will say just too, I, have the past couple of years have reviewed residency applications, right? So not fellowship, but residency. And I'd like to hopefully think too that a reviewer, so I think as the reviewer, I did look, I mean, we are asked to consider publications as part of our rankings of candidates, right? But you better believe that when I was looking at every single one of these applications, I was looking actually, clearly I was reviewing 25 applications, I couldn't read every paper, but I was looking at the titles, I was looking at the journals, I was looking to see how that matched with their personal statement or their cover letter to kind of understand how all these pieces went together. And so I might have a person in medical school that had, 10 first author publications, but that to me wasn't always the most convincing or exciting as someone who maybe had 3 that were really in line with kind of their whole application. And now again, that was me as a reviewer, but I think there's something to be said for telling a complete story, which is kind of what you said about kind of, again, doing some good maybe less, but good quality work, and how that feeds into your overall story can make a bigger impact to me than just numbers.
Whenever you apply, you're selling a package, and everything needs to fit, and it's hard to gauge that when you are just starting out and you don't have a lot of papers, and you meet Dr. Pepper and he says the facial nerve is the best thing in the world, and you publish 3 papers on the facial nerves, then later on you realize, oh, I'm more into head and neck cancer, and then you switch it. It doesn't kill you because people respect Dr. Pepper, and then they will be good papers. So, but don't do that too often. If you jump around all the time, it doesn't give a good impression. Mm-hmm.
And these are still things that are evaluated for someone who's going to be 100% clinical, faculty here. Is that true?
I have a feeling that it is. There's no tenure, but I've been in discussions about promotions, and it was just not, the person was just not ready. And one measure was actually that the person needs to publish more papers, and that has been my experience. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, our lab is like, we're probably the other extreme where it's like, I like to make really big questions that like a non-scientist in a room can understand and then like tell it in like a giant 7-figure cell paper that takes us many years, and that's obviously not conducive to.
Yay.
Hey, sorry. We're talking, maybe you can weigh in on this, John.
This is a great question,
Yeah.
John. Weigh in.
We're wondering, I guess the question was, for residents trying to distinguish themselves, be competitive, let me see, I have it written down here. So the goal of getting as many papers out as possible is not always compatible with learning how to do good research, but how do they balance the need for publishing all these papers, to get a faculty position or something with, doing the type of research they might want to do, or is it really important that they publish a lot of papers when we review, faculty candidates and those kinds of things?
So the question is quantity important? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Right, and then how do you like rectify this need for numbers with this also hopefully desired want to do like learn how to do good and meaningful science, right?
I mean, I think it's a really hard question to answer because it's so personalized. I think numbers always kind of, on the first glance, it always looks really impressive, right?
Yeah.
When somebody has a large number of papers, but I think it has to be woven into the narrative, right? The kind of what is this person all about? Is there a track record and trajectory of some question that they want to answer? And is there evidence that this person has passion about this question? The question is important, it's worth answering, and the person can answer the question, with given the right resources. It's just like writing a grant. I think a grant is based on an important question and whether or not the PI can answer the question. So when evaluating a candidate for faculty positions, I think that's what people look for. The person could have a lot of papers, but not a really important goal or question, and then I don't know if that's somebody that a department really wants.
I think a person who applies or puts up a case, makes a case for themselves, needs to actually point that out in their statement in some way, because the search committee or the promotion committee may not even see it. Mm-hmm. So I think always making a case for that trajectory is really helpful and important, pointing out, okay, I have not 15 papers, I have 4, but these are really sweet, really good.
So I'll push back a little bit on that. I think a lot of it also depends on the level of the person. So I think if you're evaluating a medical student, it would be unfair to start looking at the trajectory of what they're publishing, right? Because at that point they're pretty on the clinician. And I think at that level, quantity says something, but also rather than looking at whether all the papers tell a unified story, but looking at, I guess, the impact level of the journals they're publishing in, the types of research. Obviously, doing an original research is different from doing case report. And I think that might be, a pretty good indicator of how motivated that person is, to have the level of intellectual curiosity, even if the topics are pretty diverse, right? Because you need somebody who has that intellectual curiosity, who's motivated, and then they can figure out where do they want to take their career to, and then that trajectory can become more narrow as they progress.
From online, the Zoom chat, I think, is that Al Morani said the faculty candidate question is different than the fellowship candidate version for this question. It's a good point. It's like, it is different. Like, Al, do you want to comment on that?
Hi guys, thank you for letting me just obnoxiously join in. This is a topic of great interest to me, and I appreciate Dr. Meister reaching out. Yeah, right. So, how big is the circle we're drawing here, right? When you're a fellowship candidate, trying to get a gig, and what is a fellowship director looking for, right? Generally, they're looking for legacy, reliability and legacy. Faculty, you're looking for exactly as described. You're looking for someone who's going to have the capability and desire to ask and answer questions in their field and contribute, represent the department, not light money on fire, right? So I think the fellowship, which came up earlier, the fellowship question is really interesting. Why do fellowships care if residents do research, right? It's about their legacy and changing the field. And that's really cool. And we're interested, 100% of our fellows have gone into academics. We're really interested in that. But at each one of these stages, and I'll stop the speech soon, when we're looking at medical students applying to residency, and the masks that they wear, it was alluded to earlier about concealing what they really want to do and playing the game to write the pubs because that's all the only number left. I just think we have to think about what we're asking for. Are we creating mini-me's? Are we getting that light bulb moment where they go, wow, this is cool, I could do this? I mean, that's magic when it happens, but I do think we need to think, how big is the circle? What is it we're trying to do? So when you come from a place like Stanford, a remarkable academic institution, and I would say our University of Washington, which, all our residents do 6 and 7 years, this is who we are. But when we talk about our field in general, it gets a little different. So I'm glad you guys are having this conversation, and I think it's going to be really important for leadership like you guys. It's a remarkable place just to really lead this discussion. So thanks for letting me kind of chime in.
Want to go to the next question?
I think we had, let's do another one. So if someone's not interested in research at all, is it important for them to do it to understand sort of new therapies that are being tested and how they can implement them in their practices? And also, are we doing enough to teach that facet? Someone who knows they don't want to do research, they don't like it, but
So the question is, if they know they don't want to do research, but
they're not interested in research, but is there still value in them participating? Will that, in terms of affecting the way they, carry out their care?
I definitely think so. I think it's all about how much time there is and how times are a scarce resource and how best to apply the time. But I definitely think there's value in doing research, even if you're not going to do research. I think I kind of had this analogy. It's like when during tumor board, non-surgical people will look at a scan of a recurrent cancer, and on the scan it looks very easy to take out. But if you've done surgery, that's going to be really difficult to take out. Same thing with research. If you've done it, then you kind of know that's a really difficult question to answer. Or research isn't perfect, so this is what we've concluded, but it might not actually work out perfectly that way. And I think if you have an appreciation for how research is done, I think that helps.
I think research also teaches you so much about how to think critically, how to evaluate literature, how to ask questions, right? Which I like to think I use in my clinical practice all the time, apart from doing research. I mean, at least in like speech pathology programs, there's always be like so much push against students about not like taking a research methods course or taking statistics or like reading and synthesizing papers. And it just drove me nuts because it's really how, again, we need to be thoughtful consumers to do our clinical jobs well. And I think having some degree of experience doing research, understanding that process is going to just even inform how you consume research as you go forward and hopefully use that to inform your practice. So no, not everyone has to do research as part of their job. And in fact, if we say that, that's like probably a disservice. We're here because we're in academic medicine and it was important to us, but it doesn't have to be part of everyone's job. But I think having at least some degree of understanding and appreciation of the process really lends itself well for success.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that if you want to be good in something, taking the tumor out, you may need, maybe after 20 years of practice and experience, you're getting better and better, right? And with doing research is actually similar. You're getting calmer and you're designing the experiments in a different way, and you're telling people to do things in different ways than how it was when I started, for example. We were gung-ho going for the most important questions and got our fingers burned so often. So you go a little slower and you try to cover your bases. And I think it's important for people to understand that there are different approaches, there are different levels of doing it, come with experience. And sometimes you get lucky, but that is not the norm. And I think we need to communicate that to the residents, because they need to understand and explain to their patients that this thing they read about in the news and they want that treatment, whether that treatment is good or bad for them, they don't know. But you need to be able to explain it to them and say, well, this is highly experimental and I don't think it works, or the other way around.
Yeah, I know. I mean, maybe there's an element of appreciating like how the data was generated. My wife is an oncologist, but she always wants to see the scans. She doesn't want to just trust the radiologist's take on it, on their summary. And I think, there's probably an element of doing research where you kind of hone, and she was a PhD before that, but you kind of hone your ability to just look at data and interpret whether, how much weight you should put on it and how strong the conclusions were that were drawn. And maybe some of that comes from actually doing research and would affect how you would, interpret those data, or, change the way you practice, or interpret the newest study in New England Journal as maybe not quite as black and white as it's painted out to be, or the New York Times.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing that I don't think gets talked about very much, because it's a small slice of why someone who's trending away from research might see value in it. But if you foresee yourself potentially in an academic department, in academia, as a clinician, from the social and political understanding of the people you spend time with and the mission of your department, it really helps. I mean, so you can look at it as what does it do for me? And part of that is, do you really understand all the key cogs of the department, all the, the parts of the tripartite mission? It's kind of hard to understand, who is this person who comes across, what is their life like? You can just actually see that for a little while, and you can say, research is challenging, research is hard. Here are the things that they deal with, funding this enterprise. And this is all part of keeping the ship moving in the right direction. So I found it a great learning experience just from understanding the people you spend time with, particularly if you're going to be in academia. That'll be part of it.
So next question is sort of an obvious one, should research be associated with the prestige of a program? And I just have the words of Rob Jackler in mind, where he starts very often explaining about the department that we are a research-heavy department. That's sort of his speech, right, from old times. And the comment is also, currently the top-ranked programs tend to be the programs with a strong research arm. So for residents who are invested in research, this is the ideal place, right? But what if someone wants to go to a clinically very strong program and not do research? Would they cut themselves out to go to these prestigious places or would they have to sell themselves to do research just for the sake of it? Maybe not by pulling straws anymore, but do they still have to go through that process and pretend to be interested in research? And should, otherwise, the value of the clinical volume and the clinical complexity be more worth it? It's difficult for people who actually want to become pure clinicians, don't really care about the research, but really want to do the clinical stuff and want to go to Stanford or want to go to UW or some other place, right? I don't know. I'm the geneticist.
So the first question really was, should the prestige of a program be associated with should research be intricately tied with that? That was the gist of the.
I mean, it's sort of a fact. It was sort of a.
It is kind of a fact, but should that be the case or not? Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of your extramural reputation comes from scholarship, right?
Yeah.
I mean, unless you're just like you're the house or you're some of your great programs there. The clinical reputation is one thing. It's an old reference. Thank you.
Yeah.
But these students are they're walking through the front door of our field with a mask on. Now, admittedly, Stanford and UW, I'll just say, we're at one end of the spectrum, in terms of just really who we're looking for, frankly, I mean, and our academic mission. But if we look at the field as a whole, I mean, they're walking, they do not feel comfortable expressing their true intent, right? If they say the words private practice during their interviews, at 3/4 of the program, they go to in the country, they go to the bottom of the list. Is that really the field we want? That's not Stanford's problem. That's not UW's problem. But as otolaryngology leaders, this is something we should be thinking about. I'm really just delighted to hear you guys talk about this. They're faking their way through it.
Any places like ours. That's sad that it's no longer there, right? Because although they had research as well.
Yeah. Well, Rick Friedman and I were co-residents, so I'm happy to tell you all the stories when you want.
I guess I had asked that question. Part of what I'm running in my mind is I personally love research and I love trying to find mechanisms and I love basic science. I also like clinical work, but I feel like they're two different jobs. And I almost feel like it's unfair to pretend like you want to do job A when you're interviewing for job B. Not to say that research is not important, because I think that clinicians need to know how research is done so that they can advise their patients. But I think, like Dr. Mahdi was saying, faking it in order to get into residency just seems wrong. And I know that a lot of other residents are not as passionate about research as I am, and I feel like they shouldn't have to pretend to be or try to be. I mean, you can try, but if you don't like it, you shouldn't have to do it. And that's kind of what I had in the back of my mind.
I mean, I would say first and foremost, this is a clinical department. First and foremost, exceptional patient care comes first. I don't think there's any question. And I think a residency training program, first and foremost, is that surgical training and clinical training comes first. I think if anyone says otherwise, that's wrong, But I think what Stefan was saying about prestige, I think it's easy to look at scholarship and research as drivers of prestige. There's no question, because it's quantifiable.
Papers, dollars.
But it's all about impact, right? So if there's a pure clinical department with no basic science research, no translational research, but they have the best facial plastic surgeon in that department in the world, right? Or they have the best skull-based surgeon in the world. I think that brings impact and prestige to that department. So I don't think it's fair to say that prestige is equal to. I mean, that it's obvious that research brings prestige.
Yeah.
I also will say I don't know if it's universal to say that everyone is going to be quote unquote lying for the interviewing for a residency position, because there are programs. I mean, I'm only N of 1, so I can only speak to my experience, but coming from Mayo, I know that program does specifically have residents that they are training to then go out and go back to their communities in like North Dakota or South Dakota and be the private practice ENT there, because that's the only ENT available to them out there, and they're very upfront about that, and they actually kind of try and recruit those types of residents, and they may or may not be interested in research at the outset, but I think that programs like Mayo, and then there are others out there too, are a bit more I guess accepting, or they don't feel like they have to weed out quote unquote these private practice people when they have a very specific career goal in mind.
Yeah, I don't think that, to the procedures, an academic medical center has to select people who want to do research. But I think that research plays a huge role because, that is really, you can only see so many patients, right? You usually have your catchment area, but beyond the clinical care that you provide, your name gets out there also based on the groundbreaking research that you do, right? And I sort of think of it as spheres of influence. When you treat patients, you can have substantial impact in the lives of patients you physically teach, right? You train medical students and residents. You extend that sphere of influence, because not only are you impacting the patients you're treating, but you're also affecting how care is delivered by the people you've trained. When you do research, you extend that sphere even further, because now you're also affecting how care is delivered to people you've never even physically come in contact with, right? And so I don't think research is the only thing, but I think it plays a huge role for that reason.
I think as we look, John, you said something that I think is important about being clinically, like when we come here to train, teaching people to be, like, for example, in our program, great surgeons, and how that has to take priority. One way to, but I think, when I heard about this topic and coming tonight about is this valuable, I can tell you as part of my residency, we took a year off to do research, and I thought that was one of the most rewarding aspects of my entire residency, and maybe my academic career, was that time I took in the lab. But I think if we look to the future, I wouldn't be surprised if we see the majority of people doing surgery and the procedures are non-MDs in the future. I think you see so many fields encroaching on our traditional domain and territory. Dentists doing facial plastics, non-audiologists dispensing hearing aids, all kinds of folks, APPs, doing injections, doing procedures. I wouldn't be surprised if we see non-physicians taking over this aspect of our practice. So what distinguishes us from the rest going forward? And I think that what distinguishes us may be in having the intellectual curiosity and the skill set maybe to ask some of these hard questions about, so clinicians, right? As clinicians, one of the things we get a lot of experience in is face-to-face contact with the patient and seeing real-world problems and start asking, how can I do this better? What's a solution to this problem? And I think that's an advantage that clinicians have by face-to-face contact with the patients. And if you don't have the skill set to then go back, or the curiosity to go back and say, how might I devise a solution to this? Or who could I talk to have a solution to this? I think that's probably an important aspect of being a physician that we ought to try to preserve in this field. And last thing I'll just say, and I thought, Beth, you kind of used, maybe our research goals, or maybe our goals for our people should be something along the lines of, can you be really good at reading the literature? Are you good at statistics? Can you go to our journals and tease out what's crap and what isn't? And maybe that should be a goal of a research rotation, because I do agree when we ask the medical students to come in here and they bullshit us about what they're interested in. I mean, it's nice, but I mean, they, like, I I don't know, could you tell Robert Jackler was going to be, maybe you could, maybe somebody looked at him and said, I'm looking at a genius, you know? I'm sure people looked at me and thought, this guy's going to be a dog catcher. And I don't think we should really waste our time. But like, maybe there was something about Robert, you, Stefan, maybe somebody said, geez, this guy's going to get the Nobel Prize for curing hearing one day. I don't know. But maybe we should set our goals on keeping the intellectual curiosity alive and kind of reaffirming that, hey, it's okay that you're going to be a clinician because you might be an individual that has the ability to actually to really change your field or have an impact in your field in a way that a non-physician will not be able to. So I think there's value in doing research in residency is what I'd like to say.
So that
Well said.
brings it back to Julian's first question, whether the program filters out people who are really having that drive to do research, to say, well, I take a year off and I go to a lab, maybe not during residency, but maybe after residency, because I see value in that, because I want them to do a fellowship that gives me the opportunity as well to do research on the side, and maybe, just maybe, I start a lab on the side, and maybe not. I mean, but these are the people we're looking for, right?
I think the thing that Ed said was the difference. Like when I matched into residency, everyone did 1 year of research. Everybody. It wasn't a 5 and 7 program. So the culture was a little different. It was, and I think, you know, if this department wants to have impact and wants to, you know, and we're recruiting the top medical students to go on and have impact in our community, in our field. I mean, that's the kind of culture that Rob was talking about from the very beginning, about building this research-intensive culture. And you know, I can say people change, right? Like when I was finishing medical school, I was going to be a country general surgeon in some small town in like outside of Albuquerque. I don't know why I thought of that, but I wanted to live near Albuquerque for some reason. It was scheming. But then I had this one mentor who, I've told the residents this many times, but there was this one mentor who worked in our otolaryngology department. He had one technician, and it was just me, the technician, and him, and we'd listen to NPR and do experiments all day long. And he turned it around, and he got me really interested. And so, I mean, I think that happens. I think that culture change does happen and inspires people. No, it's not really answering your question, but I think in terms of, you know, why do we do research? It's not, we want to have impact. We want to change the way we deliver healthcare. But I think we also want to inspire people. We want to inspire all these talented and smart trainees.
So would you say we should bring back the old system and implement 1 year of research? Because Rob was always against that, and I bet Tina's against it because it takes the revenue out of it. And 3 months plus 3 months half-time is probably all we can afford, literally, for them to do research.
I think we actually need to shorten training, you know, in a way. I think we need to fast track to different specialties quicker, because it's just things have gotten so prolonged.
I think that's part why we try to provide opportunities for those that know that they are interested in research to make the selection on their own, that I want to apply to a program that I know going into this I'm making to do 1 extra year or 2 extra years, right? Like, I think that we need to keep providing those options, but in reality, given the way that our training has been prolonged, is it reasonable to say that on top of 5 years and then 1 or 2 years of fellowship, we're going to require everyone to do? I mean,
the
It's really hard.
psychology doesn't work well, I think, from the trainee's perspective. You want to entice the best candidates,
Yeah.
and the way that you do that is say, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
If you come here, you can turn into the top surgeon in your field, you can turn into a surgeon scientist.
Yeah.
You know, the world is your oyster. That's how you get people in the door who are tops. But then, like Beth said, you have to enable them to do that. Like if they, they come in and they're like, I'm on a 5-year thing, but hey, I just got really passionate about this one topic. Then enabling that really deeply so that they can transition into it if they want. I think that's the way you get the best, the best people interested.
Right. I mean, I think that that's a really great point, right? And it's like, we have a structure, but we also have some flexibility within that structure, to provide you the best training to understand that things can change sometimes as you go.
It's like a garden, it's fertile ground, and you have a fruit garden or an herb garden, or wherever you like to grow, you can grow.
I think, John, you said how impactful being with your mentor was. Like, if that interaction had never taken place, if you had never wound up in that environment, you'd probably be in Albuquerque with your cowboy hat on.
I probably would.
So I mean, I think some of the most wonderful things I can think of in residency was going to meetings and the pleasure of publishing. That is just a singular pleasure to see your name in print, and the work you've done as at the title of a journal. Who doesn't like opening up a journal? I know you do, JP. You like opening up the journal.
I go online.
I see you do.
Online.
Like, you present people that are highly gifted and can do anything and put them into an environment where their intellectual curiosity can flourish and grow. I mean, I think that is an opportunity and something about our field that we have to preserve that option and that ability. Yeah.
I think I agree with what's being said, and in my experience, when you get the bug with a question and you don't really want to go to bed, or you want to wake up as soon as possible so you can do the next experiment, and it's your question and you want to know the answer. There's nothing like that in life. There's nothing else like it. Maybe, a really successful patient outcome comes close to it. But I think that not everyone has caught the bug, and people will catch it at different times. And I think what's important is giving people the opportunity. But if you force them, or if you say everyone's going to do a year of research, people may not take to it as well. I don't know. But you still need to have some time so that people can, have interactions like you had, Dr. Sanu. And I think my first 2 research experiences were terrible, actually. I didn't want to do research at all. And that changed eventually. And obviously now I'm really passionate about it. But I think that opening up opportunities like that for people is the key.
I think also if you force people to do a year of research, you're going to run into issues where you don't have a diversity of research fields to satisfy different, areas of interest. Like, I went into residency knowing that I wanted to do research, but the type of research I did in residency had nothing to do with what I was interested in. Actually, it was supposed to be basic science research. Even got a core grant to do it, but wasn't really what I was interested in. If I had to do it for a year, it would have been like a waste of time for me.
I think there's one more question, but I think we tackled this one sort of already, but it was more from a practical perspective, just asking how clinical research productivity is evaluated in an academic medical department such as ours, formally during the hiring process, and then and by departments and committees, and then informally by faculty, especially research faculty, I guess, like us. And then as we hear and see these different types of research engagement and quality by clinical faculty at different institutions, sort of how do we evaluate these types of things? I think we sort of covered some of that, but I don't know if you were here for that. Yeah, I guess you were kind of came in at that point, John, but how we evaluate during these processes, different types of research. I don't know, as a basic science researcher, how you think about applications or different research. We kind of covered that a little bit, but.
Right. I mean, it goes back to that. Someone pointed out that it really depends on the stage of the person that is being evaluated. And if we're looking for grad students, we're looking for people who have already had interest in research, who were driving projects, who have strong letters of recommendation that this person hangs out in the lab all the time and wakes up early to do the next experiment, right? That's exactly the letter you would like to receive. And later on, its impact of the publications, a credible trajectory work. So I think that's a clinician scientist, that's as close as I can get to a clinician, evaluating a clinician. I would say I think it's important for a clinician scientist to be actually the person who is driving the lab. I think that is important. So if there is an involvement in the way the lab is run, and I know John is in the lab and is interacting with his people and it trains them to do certain things, and after maybe a year the people are trained in well enough so that you don't have to look over their shoulder anymore, and they come back 2 months later and said, look, this is the result or so. But for building that kind of infrastructure is going to be important, and I think that's the next evaluation I would look for. And I don't know, just counting papers, as was pointed out before, with clinicians, I think it's not practical. But as I said, it's the currency.
It's not currency here, though, because a paper, everybody knows a paper is not a paper, it's not a paper. And research is a part of our mission and mission of the university. So here it's the impact, the quality. Is it changing, if it's clinical work, is it changing how people practice clinical medicine? Is it changing how we do surgery? Is it really changing the field for the better? So this is really how it's evaluated. It's not just a number.
Yeah,
And in fact, I think that in many ways clinicians publish too much. In a way, it's polluting the literature because everything gets published right away, and then you can't even figure out what's important. And thankfully, most of it is not even relevant, so we can all stay afloat, because otherwise, how do you keep up with that
Exactly.
exponential increase in
Exactly.
literature? Everything more important, all of us will be
Saturated.
sinking very quickly. Yes, there is the perceived notion by some, but not by Stanford, that a sheer number counts. We look at the impact.
Yeah, in fact, for promotion, there is no criteria for number of papers or even whether or not you have a grant. That's not even considered. It's all, and everyone's different, right? So like Nate's research is different than your research, different than Beth's. So they solicit letters from experts in whatever field, and they ask that expert, what is the impact of this person's research, and is it of the top quality? And that's how they decide.
Well, John, although having grants is not a requirement, Stanford has very loosely written promotion criteria for any category. I've actually asked for more clarity in that regard, and I've been told that it's by design, because Stanford doesn't want to put anyone into a box. But with that being said, I don't know anyone who has been promoted on the UTL line without papers and grants.
Yeah.
But the reason that was given to me as to why that's not written as a statement is because, maybe there could be someone who is making waves, who is in the media all the time, who's writing textbooks. They're not papers, but is really influencing the public opinion. They are becoming a thought leader, and they could be promoted even in the UTL line, theoretically. Again, I don't know of that happening in the School of Medicine, but it must happen somewhere in some other school, and that's why it exists as a category.
Yeah, and you know, the study sections at NIH are the most stringent judges of that research, right? So, you know, if you get a grant, then that also is an indicator that your research is top quality. So,
That's right, you can't really get a grant without publications. even training grants.
Yeah, that's true anymore. 100%.
I mean, it's the difference between what is written, basically very vaguely, something is written, and what is the practice. And the practice is still that, as you said, papers, grants, impact.
I'm going to make Nate blush, but his paper, this cell paper on lymph node metastases and systemic tolerance of metastases, that's a paper that has had huge impact. I mean, I've kind of followed it. It's been cited a huge number of times in just the last year, which is incredible. And everyone at the meetings is talking about it, right? So that's an example of kind of changing the way people think about things. And I think, so that's I think what we strive for.
So for his promotion, he needs to get a better paper.
He's got to get 10 more of those.
Yes, yes, he at least needs to maintain the lot. But indeed, that's why for our improved, updated vision statement, we now have qualifiers for each of the 3 mission areas. We talk about outstanding patient care, we talk about groundbreaking research, and we talk about innovative education. So we're trying to be really specific in terms of what it is that we are aiming for. Because again, there is research and research and research. And at Stanford, we're looking for groundbreaking research in any domain. Basic science, translational, clinical, but it's having an impact. It's changing how people think about diseases, how they treat them, how we are outlining path towards new discoveries.
Maybe for like one very practical sentiment, I think something it's not quite the same thing, but I spent a lot of time thinking about it. It's like, what's the right person for a project? So kind of coming back to some of the things we talked about earlier, like I think if you are thinking about doing research and you don't have a lot of experience about it or whatever, I think just being candid with the labs that you're interested in, the PI in particular, about what your skills are, where you're coming from, how much time you have to accomplish your goals. I mean, we have master students in our lab and stuff who have a lot less experience. So thinking about, we design projects that should fit those students appropriately. So I think like
We as mentors
yeah,
should also be working really closely with
yeah,
our resident to make sure that we're helping facilitate success. That's really critical.
and like what they need is like I'm not going to put someone on a paper that's going to take 7 years.
No,
They're going to be
no,
gone and
no,
then,
right?
and
And
they
like,
need the paper.
and
for-
we have to, for someone who doesn't have a lot of, we need to be in charge of that. Like we have to be responsible and take onus for that too as mentors, right? About saying what is realistic, right? Because we know. They don't.
I mean, that's the hard part for residents. For example, in my lab, when my experiences were that they were not really productive times because they were 3 months and it was very hard. And back then the residents were overworked and people who picked my lab were basically taking a 3 months, take it easy time, which I ultimately think was maybe helping them, but it didn't inspire them like it inspired you. So that said, over time, 10 years older, that will be more structured now because the lab has more experience and maybe the lab is not run with many undergrads. My lab was mainly run with postdocs over the years, but now we have a mentoring kind of pipeline in the lab and we have different hierarchies and so it's working.
Yeah.
So if you as students or as residents look for research labs, go out and interview a couple of these labs and then talk to the people who run around in the lab, if they're postdocs or so, talk to them, get inspired. Don't just pick this topic and say, oh yeah, this is a famous cancer immunologist and I want to work with him because he has done this and that. Just interview the lab. You have all the right to interview your target lab as the lab has the right to interview you. Right? I think that's important.
Do y'all have other questions? No, I think we are. probably well past the
Out
hour.
of time.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. It was a
Thanks.
great discussion.
Thank you. It's fun.